My mother removed me from her will because I don't like my new father, but when I inherited $12 million, she demanded money from me. I don't think anyone ever dreams of a childhood like mine. To me, family was supposed to mean safety, love, and warmth. Those were things I only saw on TV or heard other kids talk about. When my mother, Linda, remarried Richard, I thought maybe things would finally get better. I was wrong. Linda had always been distant. I don't know if it was that way from the start or if it happened gradually over time. By the time I was old enough to notice, she felt more like a roommate drifting in and out of my life than a real mother. She was constantly busy, fussing over the house, or more often, over Richard and his son, Brian, who, to her, could do no wrong. It felt like I was the extra in a play where I was supposed to be the main character, but instead, I was cast as the outsider, the one person who never quite fit. From the start, Richard made it clear he didn't like me. He acted like my existence was a problem he had to endure, and not subtly, either. He was loud and relentless about it. There was a look of disgust in his eyes whenever he glanced my way, as if my presence ruined his perfect life. He didn't bother hiding his opinions. Every little thing I did was wrong, and he made sure I knew it. "Jessica, why can't you be more like Brian?" he would sneer, crossing his arms at the dinner table, where every meal felt like a test I was doomed to fail. Brian, of course, was the golden child. He was Richard's son from his first marriage and just a year older than me. He carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that made everyone love him, or at least that's how it seemed. Brian wasn't outright mean to me, but he didn't make my life easier, either. He would watch me with the same smug indifference as his father, as if he knew I would never belong in their world. I felt so alone in that house. Linda seemed to lose her voice whenever Richard was around. She would smile and nod at him, her eyes soft with a strange mixture of adoration and fear. It was like she'd forgotten I existed. She only acknowledged me when Richard or Brian wasn't around. On the rare occasions I asked her why she let Richard treat me so badly, she would deflect. "Jessica, he's just strict. He wants the best for you," she'd say in that empty tone, not even looking at me. I stopped asking after a while. Richard wasn't content to just berate me with words. He seemed determined to keep me in my place. I remember one time when I came home from school with a report card that wasn't perfect, mostly B's and a couple of A's. I thought I'd done well, considering how I had to squeeze study time around the endless chores Richard assigned me. But as soon as I handed him the report card, I knew it wouldn't be enough. This is what you call effort," he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. He crumpled the paper in his hand and threw it back at me. "Jessica, why can't you be like Brian?" he demanded, pulling out Brian's report card, a perfect row of A's, as if it were a masterpiece. I wanted to scream, to tell him how unfair he was, to explain how much harder things were for me. But the words caught in my throat, and all I could manage was a weak, "I'm trying." "Try harder," he muttered, shaking his head before sending me off to my room. Linda, as always, just watched silently, a sad smile playing on her lips, as if she wanted to help but was too afraid to do so. I would sit in my room for hours, staring at the walls, feeling like I was sinking into the floorboards. Those walls were the only things that heard my voice, the only things that held my pain. They didn't judge, didn't ignore, and didn't make me feel like I was a mistake. There comes a moment when you just can't take it anymore. For me, that moment came one night after another argument. I was 17, just weeks away from graduation. I'd stayed up late finishing a school project when Richard stumbled in, reeking of alcohol. He took one look at me, slouched over my books at the kitchen table, and sneered. "You think you're going to get somewhere with that nonsense? Who do you think you are?" Something in me snapped. I didn't even respond. I just went to my room, shut the door, and sat in the darkness. My head buzzed with one thought. I had to leave. I had to get out of that house before it swallowed me whole. The next morning, I walked to school feeling different, like a door had opened that I hadn't noticed before. My best friend, Sarah, noticed it too. She was the steady presence in my life, someone who didn't pry, but always understood. "I'm leaving," I told her. "I can't stay there anymore." She nodded, holding my hand without a word. It felt like, for the first time, someone was truly on my side. That evening, I packed a small bag with a few clothes, some cash I'd saved from tutoring sessions, and my favorite books. I wasn't willing to leave those behind. I didn't tell Linda or Richard. I didn't want their voices in my head or their attempts to drag me back. But of course, things weren't that simple. Linda noticed the bag as I walked down the hallway. She stopped me, her gaze flicking between my face and the duffel bag. "Jessica, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice thin and wavering. "I'm leaving, Mom. I can't live here anymore." The words came out stronger than I'd imagined, fueled by a force I didn't know I had. Linda blinked, her mouth opening slightly before she let out a soft, bitter laugh. "And where do you think you'll go? You don't have anything, Jessica. The world isn't kind to girls like you. I'd rather face whatever's out there than stay here," I said firmly. She sighed, shaking her head like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "You'll be back," she muttered, turning away. I slipped out before Richard came home. Her words trailed behind me like a ghost, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The first few nights, I crashed on Sarah's couch. Her family knew me well enough, and her mom even offered to let me stay as long as I needed. It was tempting, but I didn't want to burden them. I needed to stand on my own. One afternoon, while scanning job boards at the local library, I met someone who would change everything. Marissa was a bright-eyed woman in her early 30s who ran a local coffee shop. She noticed me staring at job postings and handed me a flyer. "We're looking for help at the shop. Interested?" It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. By the end of the week, I was clocking in for my first shift. Marissa quickly became more than a boss. She was like the sister I'd never had, a mentor who seemed to understand what I was going through without me saying a word. Living independently was harder than I'd imagined. Rent, food, and bills piled up, and I found myself stretching every dollar. But for the first time, I felt like my life was my own, not a puppet show controlled by Richard and Linda. One day, out of nowhere, Linda showed up at the coffee shop. She looked completely out of place among the cheerful decor and the smell of fresh coffee. Her face was tense, drawn, and guarded. Marissa, always observant, noticed immediately. "Jess, someone's here to see you," she called softly, her tone careful. My heart raced as I stepped out from the back. Linda's gaze met mine, cold and assessing. "Jessica," she began, her voice clipped. "You've made your point. Now come home." I took a deep breath, standing my ground. "I'm not going back, Mom. I'm happy here." She let out a sharp, hollow laugh. "Happy? Living like this? You're wasting your life, Jessica. You don't have a future here." Marissa, who had been quietly watching from the counter, stepped in. "Excuse me, ma'am, but Jessica has a job and a place here. She's doing just fine." Linda's face twisted with anger, her lips trembling as if she wanted to scream. But instead, she shook her head and looked at me with a strange sadness. "You'll regret this," she whispered before walking out the door. It took hours to shake off her words. Marissa sat with me, her steady presence a reminder that I had made the right choice. I wasn't going back, not to the life I'd left behind, not to the people who had made me feel small for so long. Over time, I found my rhythm. I saved up enough money for a tiny studio apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, barely enough room for a bed and a table, but it was mine. Marissa helped me move in, and we spent the evening painting the walls a cheerful yellow. We laughed and talked like old friends, as if we had known each other forever. Despite the challenges, I finally felt free. The fear and shame that had followed me for years began to fade, replaced by a quiet pride. I wasn't just surviving. I was building something for myself. But the past has a way of finding you. One evening, as I was closing up the shop, Richard walked in. He hadn't aged well. His face was harsher, his eyes colder, but the contempt in his gaze was the same as always. He stood silently, staring at me as if he was sizing me up. "What do you want?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. He shrugged, glancing around the shop with thinly veiled disgust. "Linda's been worried. Thought I'd come check on you." I laughed bitterly. "Linda's not worried about me. She never was." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You think you're better than us now? Living here, working in this dump?" I felt my anger rise, but I kept my voice calm. "Maybe I am, Richard. Maybe I'm finally where I belong." He snorted, shaking his head. "You'll always be a disappointment, Jessica." For the first time, his words didn't hurt. They didn't mean anything. I just watched him leave, feeling a strange sense of closure. I had escaped. I had built a life for myself, and no one could take that away from me. Months later, the call that changed my life came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was wiping down tables at the cafe when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something made me answer. "Hello, is this Jessica Walker?" A calm, professional voice asked. It had a faint British accent. "Yes, speaking," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron. "My name is Alice Thompson. I'm calling on behalf of the law firm representing the estate of your late Aunt Mary Benson. Do you have a moment to speak?" I froze. Aunt Mary? I had only met her a handful of times as a kid. She was my mother's older sister, a mysterious woman who lived halfway across the country. My memories of her were fuzzy, images of a tall, elegant woman dressed in bold colors, always moving with purpose. She had been one of those people you never forgot, even if you didn't know them well. "Yes, I remember her," I said slowly, trying to process her words. "But why are you calling me?" Alice paused before responding. "Your Aunt Mary passed away a few months ago. In her will, she named you as one of her beneficiaries. I'd like to set up a time for you to come to our office and discuss the details." The word beneficiary hung in the air like a surreal echo. I stammered out a response, agreeing to meet her at the law firm the next day. That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing. Aunt Mary's death was a shock, but the idea that she had left me anything was almost impossible to grasp. We hadn't been close. She was more like a distant legend in my family. Why had she chosen me? The next morning, I arrived at the law firm early, my nerves buzzing. The office was in an elegant old building downtown, the kind of place I never imagined myself stepping into. Alice Thompson met me in the lobby, a tall woman in a sharp suit, her expression serious but kind. She led me to a small conference room and handed me a thick envelope. "These are the details of your aunt's estate," she explained, watching me carefully. "I understand this may come as a shock, but Mrs. Benson's assets amount to approximately $12 million. She left all of it to you." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. $12 million. My hands trembled as I held the envelope, my mind reeling. It felt like the universe had flipped upside down, like reality itself had bent into something unrecognizable. "Are you sure?" I whispered, barely able to find my voice. Alice nodded, her expression gentle. "Mrs. Benson was very clear in her wishes. She wanted you to have the entirety of her estate." She went over the details. Aunt Mary had left me her mansion, a sprawling estate in Connecticut, along with various investments and accounts. The wealth was overwhelming, a sum I couldn't even comprehend. I had spent my life scraping by, counting every penny. Now suddenly I was a millionaire. As I left the office, clutching the envelope to my chest, I felt like I was walking in a dream. The air outside was crisp, the city bustling around me, but everything felt distant, as if I were floating above it all. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the couch, staring at the envelope. The shock began to turn into a giddy disbelief. I called Sarah, my voice trembling as I shared the news. She was silent for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Jess, are you serious? This is insane." "I know," I said, laughing along with her, my heart pounding. "I don't even know what to do with it. It doesn't feel real." Over the next few days, I started making plans. The money opened up a world I had never even considered. I could buy my own place, travel, and finally get away from the shadow of my past. But as exciting as it was, there was a strange sadness that lingered. Aunt Mary had left me everything, yet I barely knew her. I found myself wondering about her life, her choices, and why she had chosen me. One afternoon, I decided to visit the mansion. I had never seen it, only heard stories about the grand house where Aunt Mary had lived. When I arrived, I was struck by the sheer size of it, a sprawling estate surrounded by towering oak trees, with ivy creeping up the walls. The house was beautiful, elegant, and mysterious, much like the woman who had owned it. I wandered through the rooms, each one filled with remnants of Aunt Mary's life. The furniture was tasteful, carefully selected, and the walls were lined with bookshelves overflowing with novels, poetry, and memoirs. I felt a strange connection to her as I explored, as if I were piecing together the life of a woman I had always wanted to know but had never been given the chance. In the study, I found a photograph of Aunt Mary as a young woman. She was stunning, with the same confident expression I remembered from my childhood. I couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to leave everything to me, a niece she barely knew. As I looked around the room, I felt a sudden resolve. I wanted to honor her memory, to live up to the trust she had placed in me. In the weeks that followed, I began to settle into my new life. I bought a small condo in the city, a beautiful space filled with light, where I could finally feel at home. I quit my job at the coffee shop, though saying goodbye to Marissa and my coworkers was harder than I had expected. They had been my family, my support system, and leaving them felt like closing a chapter of my life. But as grateful as I was, the inheritance brought complications I hadn't anticipated. News of my windfall spread quickly, and soon people I hadn't heard from in years started reaching out. Old acquaintances, distant relatives, even high school classmates I barely remembered suddenly wanted to reconnect. It was as if the money had turned me into someone else, someone they wanted to know. It wasn't long before Linda and Brian found their way back into my life. It started with a letter from Linda, a neatly written note that arrived in the mail one evening. She didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge the years of neglect, but she wrote about how proud she was of me, how she had always known I would be successful. The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to rewrite history now that I had something she wanted. A few days later, Brian showed up at my condo unannounced. He looked the same as I remembered, tall, confident, with that same smug smile that had always grated on me. But there was a glint of desperation in his eyes, a vulnerability I had never seen before. "Jessica," he said, his voice smooth and overly polite. "I thought we could catch up. You know, it's been a while." I looked at him incredulously. "You mean since you and your dad ignored me? Since you made it clear I wasn't part of the family?" He shifted uncomfortably, forcing a smile. "Come on, Jess. That was a long time ago. We're family. I just want to make sure you're okay." I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger. "You didn't care about me then, and I doubt you care now. This isn't about family, Brian. This is about the money, isn't it?" He faltered, his composure cracking for a moment. "Look, things have been tough since Dad passed. Daniel's in college, and Mom's been struggling. We could really use some help." I stared at him, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. For once, I had the power. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the one holding the cards. But as tempting as it was to turn him away, to make him feel the rejection I had felt, I knew it wouldn't change anything. "Brian," I said quietly, "I don't owe you or Mom anything. You made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't part of your family. So don't pretend now." He looked at me, defeated, before nodding and leaving without another word. As I watched him go, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The inheritance had changed my life, but more importantly, it had given me the freedom to finally stand up for myself. After that, I made the decision to cut all ties with Linda, Brian, and anyone else from my past who sought to exploit me. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I blocked their numbers, deleted their messages, and instructed Rachel, my lawyer, to handle any further communication. I turned my focus to the people who had been there for me through everything: Sarah, Marissa, and a few close friends who had supported me without question. They had been my rock, my family, in every way that mattered. I realized that I didn't need the approval or acceptance of people who only wanted to use me. In the end, the inheritance wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming my life, my identity, and my worth. I wasn't the scared little girl they had tried to control. I was free, independent, and for the first time, truly at peace.